My name is Leo Casey. I'm Executive Director of the Albert Schenker Institute. And it is our pleasure tonight to host a book conversation um, with one of the co editors and one of the authors of a new book, which takes off from the teacher strikes of the last 2 years, Strike for the Common Good. Um, Rebecca Gibbons, who is one of the co editors of the collection, is an associate professor of labor studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and is the author of the book Challenge to Change Reforming Healthcare on the Front Line in the United States and the United Kingdom. Joe McCartin is professor of history at Georgetown University and heads up its Kalmanowitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. He is the author of a number of books, including Collision Course, the definitive study of the famous or infamous PATCO strike broken by Ronald Reagan. He was a driving force behind the development of the Bargaining for the Common Good Network, which is in part the subject of his essay in this collection. We will begin with brief presentations, first from Rebecca and then from Joseph.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Victoria and Leo at the Schenker Institute for hosting us. It's great to be here. It's really nice to have an opportunity to talk about this book, which I find exciting, not so much for what I did, but for what everybody else did, which I'll talk a little bit about. I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief. Joe and I both will, so we can get into discussion and interaction, which is always the fun part. This book, Strike for the Common Good, Fighting for the Future of Public Education, I like to hold up the cover, not just because that's what people do, but because it has a beautiful photo of from the LA teachers strike that I think is a very good visual representation of what we're kind of talking about here. In the book, we try to sort of answer the question of where did teacher strikes go and why are they back? And then I guess the question is sort of how are they back and what do they look like? And Joe can talk more about that in terms of how they look a bit different than they did look before. And I think that a lot of folks listening today are probably somewhat or very knowledgeable about the history of teacher strikes and certainly about teachers' unions. So I'll say a few things which might be familiar to some of you, but try to draw a few key threads together. Many of you, I'm sure, know that there were, teacher strikes in the 60s and the 70s, and then a complete lull. So those strikes were often around issues that I would consider a bit more protectionist, certainly didn't look like the strikes we've seen in recent years. But then in the 80s and 90s, we saw hardly any teacher strikes at all, very, very few. And if you want to know more about that, you can read Joe's book about PATCO. And you can also find some of that in this volume. What we did in the book then to sort of try to bring together the response to those questions is we said, we want to hear from the people who really did this. So we do have some chapters written by scholars and academics, but we also have a lot of contributions from teacher organizers and others who were deeply involved in these strikes. So parents, community members, students, other folks, so that it's not just a scholarly analysis, but it's an on-the-ground account of what happened and why and how. So what we kind of where we kind of start, I guess, in the book, I mean, you could say we start with Chicago in 2012, which I think is when many of us would say that teacher strikes kind of burst back into action and into our consciousness. But I think it's more appropriate to start in 2008 with the recession and the understanding that public investment in education never recovered from the 2008 recession. So that recession became an opportunity for those that want to cut public education, cut taxes, attack public employees and public employment, and diminish the power of public sector unions. 2008 created a very, very good opportunity and they really used it to the fullest. So teachers' pay, as Sylvia Allegretto shows in her chapter, never recovered. And so we came to a point in, around 2018 where teachers' pay was absolutely stagnant. Teachers were struggling to make ends meet. They were working second and third jobs. And as you guys all know, healthcare costs have been skyrocketing. So when the healthcare costs went up and the salaries were relatively stagnant, it was really a struggle to make ends meet. And what we saw then is this sort of, I would say, inspirational strike in Chicago in 2012. Inspirational, I don't just mean like when you watch a movie and it's inspirational. I mean, it inspired other teachers to action. And that 2012 strike, where the teachers went on strike for the schools Chicago students deserve, really showed that it was possible to work in alliance with communities and to frame common good demands that were about proper public schools that could not be flipped around and, claimed to be only about greedy, self-interested teachers. The organizing was deep and long-term, and there was a broad shared understanding among, families, parents, and the community that teachers were on strike for quality schools, not for narrow self-interest. And so that strike really started to embed in the understanding of teachers all over the country in states where it was not necessarily so easy for teachers to strike. After Trump was elected, there was this sort of massive increase in political participation or activism, really, with things like the Women's March and this sort of, I think of it as an exercising of the muscles of getting involved, being willing to take a stand, to speak out publicly on important issues. And the appointment of Betsy DeVos drew sharp lines around public education and education policy, where before the lines of education policy were just a total mishmash across partisan lines, where there was actually a fairly broad consensus and continuity, especially with multiple presidential administrations. With the appointment of Betsy DeVos, the lines were clearly drawn and it became us against them. And so teachers and their unions were able to show, they are not on the sides of quality education. We, the teachers, and our fighting and our unions are on the side of public education. What we saw then was this spread of strikes, whether or not teachers had official, legally sanctioned access to collective bargaining, whether there was anything that looked like a traditional bargaining table, and whether or not strikes were technically legal. Teachers said, we're going to figure out how to improve public education, how to get what we need, how to get what our students need, and we're going to go where we need to get it. So in West Virginia, they had to go to the State House because their superintendents and their local school districts, which are county-based, were not the place where funding resided or decisions could be made. So they said, we're going to the State House. In other states, in Arizona also, they went to the state. And in other states where there's more mature collective bargaining relationships, places like LA, they still targeted their school districts, but they broadened the demand. So they were much more agile. In the book, we try to be really clear-eyed about successes, and I don't know if they're failures or building for next time, but not every teacher strike resulted in something like we saw in West Virginia or LA. So we have examples of, the case, for example, in Kentucky, where it was a really, really challenging situation where some teachers were much more focused on their pensions, and others were really hoping to organize and fight for bigger racial justice issues around school discipline and discipline of Black students in particular. And those fights are really, really complicated. And what we see is how much work and how long successful campaigns take. And one of the things it's really clear is that none of this is quick or easy. You can't just walk out on strike. You have to organize, and the successful strikes involve years of organizing, of building, of long-term relationships, not something that's quick and certainly not something that's easy. The sort of notion of striking and bargaining for the common good, and I'll let Joe talk much more about this, has become a really important approach to bargaining and striking. And not all successful bargaining obviously ends in strikes, and not all strikes are successful, but they tend to go very well together. And I should say, I use bargaining in a very broad sense. Again, you might be, I would say you're still bargaining even without a bargaining table in many cases. There is a lot of fighting for demands that were outside that narrow legal scope of bargaining, but nevertheless were absolutely essential. So getting immigration enforcement out of schools, for example, questions around school funding, which often aren't only within the purview of a school district, but need to go to the state or other players. Questions around privatization. All of those issues are much, much broader than the sort of what we might think of as, those bread and butter issues defined by a narrow scope of bargaining. And the last thing I'll say is just giving the example of Arizona, which is these massive, massive teacher walkouts in 2018, very much inspired by West Virginia in the most immediate instance. And Rebecca Gorelli, a teacher organizer in Arizona, has a phenomenal chapter explaining the use of digital tools when you've got a statewide campaign, and how they mobilize from digital organizing to offline actions, and that it can't live 100% online, but you can organize online and have actions then in person, whether at the State House, at each and every school. But in Arizona, the teachers, the Red for Ed movement, really framed the demands around funding. So much so that, without getting into the details exactly, but they realized there was only so much they could do at the legislature, and they needed to get a ballot initiative. And their ballot initiative had a rocky path with legal challenges. But ultimately, this past November, they had a huge resounding victory in a ballot initiative to raise taxes on the wealthy, to provide better funding for public education, which is dramatically underfunded in Arizona. And that what we see in that success is that support for increased educational funding and for what the teachers were demanding completely crossed party lines. So if you look at the election results in Arizona, you see a lot of people who voted for Trump for president and voted for, as you remember, Arizona had the Senate race as well, voted for a Republican senator, but the margin of victory for this tax the rich to pay for better public education was significantly higher. And what you see there is the result of that on the ground organizing, where teachers and their unions were demonstrating that they were fighting for the future of public education. They were fighting for their students. This was about investment in the future. And this was a broad common good demand. So I think I'll stop there and let Joe take it from here.
Well, thank you, Becky. And thank you, Leo, for inviting us to this today. And Becky, it gives me a chance to thank you and Amy Schrager-Lang for doing such a great job pulling together the essays in this book, which we can't do full justice to in the time here, but some really amazing contributions. I was lucky enough to work on a contribution which ends up being chapter 1 of the book, which I wrote with my colleague Marilyn Snyderman from the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers. And Marilyn and I focused our chapter on the importance that bargaining for the common good has played in helping to bring a revival of teacher militancy and really militancy, I would say, more broadly, even beyond teachers in recent years. We opened the chapter by talking about a startling statistic, and I suspect some people here might be aware of this, but we feel like most people who read this were not aware of it. That is that in 2018, the year of the Red for Ed strikes and a lot of teacher activism around the country, there were 20 strikes in the US that included at least 1,000 workers each. 78% of the strikers who participated in those strikes in 2018 were teachers or allied education workers. So in a kind of unprecedented way, teachers stepped to the forefront in 2018, engaging in public work actions in a way that we hadn't seen in the labor movement for quite a long time. In 2019, there were 25 such strikes of that size in the United States, and teachers still constituted more than a majority of those strikers, 63% in 2019. We don't have the figures for 2020 yet. They'll be released in another few weeks by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But just looking at 2018 and 2019, you see just the extent to which teachers have started to lead a revival of collective action in this country. And as Becky alluded to in her comments, this has been a long time coming. Since the 1980s, the ability of workers in the United States to effectively use collective action in their struggles has really been sharply diminished. Tremendous fall off in the use of strikes across the labor movement in public and private sector in the aftermath of the PATCO strike in 1981, to the point that by the mid to late 90s, teacher strikes were not only growing, fairly rare, but all across the labor movement, the ability of workers to strike was diminishing. I think it was in 2008 that we hit the nadir, I believe, of only 5 work actions in the United States that included at least 1,000 workers. So workers were not engaging in strikes because they had found increasingly that they had backfired in the past. What changed this and what allowed teachers to move to the forefront and helping us to recover this very important tool for workers? And when I say collective action, I mean not only strikes, but engaging collectively in protests, like, for example, what's going on today in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union, not wanting its members voting not to return to in-person work until it's safe. This is not a strike, it's workers who are not wanting to work under unsafe conditions at the moment, but acting collectively. Right. And what has allowed teachers to be able to move to the forefront to engage in these kinds of actions in recent years? Part of it has to do with what Becky alluded to in her comments. That is, teachers have taken it on the chin for 12 years now, going back to the Great Recession and the great cutbacks that followed that, and the austerity that was visited upon all public institutions, but especially public education. And there was a growing restiveness among teachers as we recovered from that Great Recession that our schools didn't recover, and teachers themselves weren't recovering. But that in itself would not, I think, have provided the seed for the transformation we've seen in recent years, had it not also coincided with the emergence of real creativity across many teacher union locals in the country. But, as Becky said, the Chicago teachers strike in 2012 played a key role in this. In Chicago, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in Los Angeles, and in other places around the country, teachers unions started to take a different approach to school districts. They started to bargain for the common good. And both St. Paul and Chicago helped set the tone for this in 2011 and 2012 by doing 2 things: trying to expand what it is that gets bargained about at the bargaining table, and also who is represented. And in both of those cases, in St. Paul and in Chicago, teachers allied with the community, and community people came into the bargaining process, and teachers began to bargain and demand for things that the community wanted. And so, joined together, they encouraged each other, I believe. And to hear the people who were involved in those early struggles talk about it, it meant a tremendous amount to rank and file teachers to know that they weren't fighting only for themselves, but rather for the common good in many of these settings. And so, this has been an important, I think, framing that has allowed teachers to reclaim a sense of militancy, which had all but disappeared, I think, before the emergence of these new efforts. And it should be said that this is something also that Leo has written about too in his book, The Teacher Insurgency, a strategic organizing perspective. And I think that, you know, had you not had your own book, Leo, a lot of this would have resonated very well in the chapters of the book that Becky has put together. So we're really excited at this moment in our history that there's such creativity that's emerging from teacher unions around the country. And I think that they're really helping to point the way toward a broader revival of the whole labor movement.
Thank you, Joe. And so I will start us off with some questions, but for everyone in the audience who thinks they could mount better questions than me, I would encourage you to share them with us. There is a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen there in the Zoom platform, and write out your questions. And after we're finished with my openers, we will move to yours. And so let's start with a softball question before I do the really hard ones. When you write a book or when you edit a book, you have something that you want your reader to do differently when they've read it. What is that thing in the book, Rebecca? What is that thing in your essay, Joe, that you want your reader to do differently after they've read it?
It's such a good question, Leo, and I could probably think about it and have more or different answers, but I guess I don't know if I can narrow it down to one, which an editor would probably say I should be able to narrow it down to one. But I'll say two things. One is to contextualize these strikes and understand where they fall in the arc of education and unions and public sector unions and strikes, and to sort of understand both that they fall into a larger trajectory and that they are something new and big and a really big deal. And then I think the other thing would be to understand that strikes require organizing, and that organizing is at the heart of everything. And in particular, in many of these cases, organizing for racial justice and educational equity in various forms. I think Jane McAlevey, who is one of our contributors and writes a chapter on supermajority strikes, has a very good riff about this terminology that many of us, and I've done it too, slip into, about strike waves. And she pushes back on the idea of a wave, because a wave comes from nature and a strike does not emerge organically or from nature. A strike takes work, it takes organizing, it takes strategy, it takes building. It is anything but sort of natural. So I think I would say it's the work and the organizing at the heart of strikes, as well as the context and the history that created the circumstances where this organizing happened and paid off.
Well, well said, Becky, and I don't know how to add much to that. I will say, Leo, that I can tell you've been a teacher, because that was a really well-framed question. If I were to have to add to Becky, though, and try to just make a bottom line statement about the chapter that Marilyn and I wrote, I would say that our hope is to get people to think outside the box. Think outside the box regarding what collective bargaining is for, and to think outside the box regarding who should be represented in collective bargaining, because the box has been constructed in a way that has been disempowering for us, and has led us into having to make choices and to operate within really an austerity regime that's been imposed upon us. And part of what we need to do is look outside of that box that we've been forced into. So I guess that's how I'd put it.
Good. So one of the things that I think is poorly understood in the literature is that not only were teachers obviously the lead of this sort of reinvigoration of the strike in the last years, but if you go back and you look at the last really major period of strikes in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, teachers were the vanguard of that too. And our master narratives tell us that that wasn't supposed to be the way that it was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be somebody else who did it. And so I wonder if both of you have any thoughts on why teachers are in this role as opposed to other groups of workers.
I feel like I should let the historian go first, and then I'll do the non-historian perspective.
Fair enough. You went first on the other one. So, Leo, I think it's a great question, and you alluded earlier to the fact I wrote a book on the PATCO strike in 1981. Researching that book, it really impressed upon me that the sort of center of gravity of the militancy of the American labor movement by the 1970s was squarely in the public sector. Public sector workers were really becoming more and more vocal, more and more active, and teachers really at the forefront of that. So I think you're absolutely right. And when the fiscal crises of the 1970s hit, public sector workers were really under the gun, and the hyperinflation of the 70s also contributed to a lot of the militancy that they felt. So there were a lot of things that came together in that moment to really create, and I think you're absolutely right, a moment where teachers really started to move to the forefront. You know, when that was happening, the American labor movement, I think, was still caught in a kind of self-image of itself as it existed in the 1930s. As it existed when the industrial union movement emerged. Overwhelmingly just, a default male image, but yet most of these strikers in many cases were women. Still, a movement that was not necessarily embracing itself in all of its diversity, but in the teachers' movement and in the teachers' struggle, you saw a greater amount of diversity there too. So I think part of the reason why, I think what you're saying gets forgotten is that we weren't used to at that time thinking about teachers as really, a driving force of the labor movement. It was still in many people's minds, the auto workers, the mine workers even, and others who were the iconic sort of representatives of labor. But in fact, teachers and their unions were moving to the forefront of this.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think that's right. And there are a few pieces that I think come together. One is the gendered nature of education work. And I should say that these strikes, although they're primarily by teachers, they're really by all kinds of education workers and school employees. So I did an interview with a school bus driver that's in the book. Obviously, many of you probably know that certainly those paraprofessionals and teachers' aides that are in the classroom are often part of this strikes, but also different kinds of support staff depending on the circumstances. But the work is heavily gendered. And so I think the fact that this is sort of women's work, that like much of women's work is totally undervalued, became important and became an important aspect of the understanding of why the work was so devalued. So I certainly think that's a piece of it. And then I think that the educators and their unions got really smart about organizing in a way that really explained where this came from. It wasn't just like the situation is bad and we should fix it. It was the situation is bad because of this long-standing set of interests working to underfund education and to disempower educators, right? And that's in a broader circumstance, and that harms everyone. So that organizing to get that word out there so that they essentially inoculated against people who would say, teachers are greedy or teachers are on strike for their narrow self-interest. They said, we've been having these conversations for years explaining, where our city and state's priorities are, who they're giving tax cuts to, where tax funding is going and where it's not going. And we have this deep relationship of trust so that we have built this shared understanding. And I think that's something that is a vanguard of workers going on strike. I think that still you see those who have learned these really important lessons and those maybe who have still to learn them?
So we have the curse of living in some times that are dramatically changing, and a lot has happened since you finished editing this book and writing your essay. And there's two sorts of events in particular that I'd like to raise. They might complicate the stuff, and it's good to complicate stuff because it means we're getting closer to reality. And so the first is the pandemic. And I think one of the things that has been demonstrated in the pandemic is that critique that we have done of virtual charter schools is absolutely true. And that students need in-person learning for their personal growth, for their academic learning, for their social and mental health. And so that is a very important good that we have. On the other hand, we have the issue of people's health and lives in terms of being exposed to the virus and getting seriously ill. And so how does a sort of common good perspective grapple with a situation where there's not just like one unambiguous good that everybody or all right-minded people think is correct, but there are actually two competing goods, both of which in some sense are common good issues?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say these are really, really challenging times, and we see these in the discussions and the negotiations going on all over the country about when it's safe to return to in-person schooling. But I'll say for me, this is, how I view many things. It all comes down to money. And if schools had been properly funded all along, there would have, for example, been small enough classes that it would have been easier to reconfigure to have different safe formats, whether it's hybrid or whether it's Zoom, but with small enough classes so that there's a higher sort of level of touch and contact, right? We see, if you have any doubt, look at the private schools that have been able to stay open, and they're private schools with a lot of green space so they can have outdoor classes, or they have state-of-the-art HVAC systems, or they have very, very small class sizes so they can effectively keep students in very tight, well-controlled pods, or they have enough funding for surveillance testing in some private schools, right, where they can test everyone who's going into that building once a week, right? And so they have all kinds of ability to put different safe protocols in place because they have funding, right? So all of the things that we knew for a long time, like that schools weren't properly ventilated or that there was insufficient staffing, those would have also been helpful if we're thinking about different ways to return safely. And I do think there's an irony in this is not an answer or a strategy, but there's an irony in that those who were advocating for years that we should just have free for all virtual schools with no regulation and it'll be fine, it'll be great, we'll have a sort of virtual approach to education, were also the same folks, Betsy DeVos first in line, who were screaming for everybody to get back in the classroom yesterday, right? So we sort of see that. To my mind, the common good approach is really the only one it's safe approach. And I really appreciated hearing during this real crisis for teachers who are really, it's a matter of life and death. A lot of educators have died of the coronavirus, many of whom are likely to have contracted it in schools that were not following safety protocols. But, the teachers and educators who've been very clear, they miss in-person education. They don't want to be in little boxes on their computers, and they are ready to go back when it's safe, when vaccines are well distributed, when buildings are made safe with proper ventilation. And I think that's the way to put it. I think many teachers have spoken about, their dual role as parents and educators, and they're seeing the impact on their children, or they're being, having a hard time with having their kids at home with them. And so I think really understanding that we all approach this as human beings and that it is complicated. It's not easy, but if we had properly funded schools, almost physically in some cases, but also like class size and other pieces, we would have better ability to push back on some of the unsafe opening plans or to create safe opening plans. So, proper funding, it wouldn't have stopped us from having a pandemic, but it would have given us a lot more ways to address where we are now.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And, the resource question really looms large in how we can deal with the pandemic. I would say that what the balance that needs to be struck right now, which you alluded to at the beginning, Leo, is part of what is always really there in collective bargaining in some way or another, right? In which there are competing goods. And how do you reconcile them? And how do you build a consensus to push them forward? So the pandemic has really highlighted, and especially this question of in-person teaching right now. It would be great for students if we're able to do it. Can we do it safely? We also have people's lives to consider. How do you strike that balance? It really helps us think about what's always there and why it's so important that when teachers fight, they fight not only for themselves, but for the students, their families, for the system. And I would say that teachers right now are in a almost unique position in this country in being able to hold us accountable and being able to force us to deal honestly with where we are in the pandemic, because they are really at that crucial nexus point. And by their actions, they can really help push forward the kind of policies we need. It's so scandalous that we went 10 months without a real national policy. And, teachers, organized teachers are in a position to force the question in some ways.
Okay, one last question from me, and then we'll go to the audience questions. There are a number of the essays in the book, and I have to say, neither you, Rebecca, nor Joe expressed this view yourself, so I don't know if you agree with it or not. But a number of the essays in the book have the view that strikes and direct action are what are really important in terms of moving a progressive political agenda, and that electoral politics is a diversion and a mistake. And so we've been through a very interesting political period, over the last year. And both in terms of an election itself, which I think it would be fair to say that democracy was on the ballot. And then this sort of incredible campaign to overturn the results of a democratic election. So what do you think those events say to us about this question of the relationship between being involved in electoral politics and more kind of directly political work, and being involved in direct action and strikes and actions of that nature?
Yeah, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say I think they're completely complementary and you can't succeed with only one or the other. And I'll say, one of the reasons that some of the anti-public education, anti-public employee billionaires have had such a sharp focus on this is because union members, especially public employees, are reliably Democratic voters. And if you want to attack the people voting for your opponents, like take away their unions and they won't have the ability to organize electorally. And I think while there are certainly folks who, don't see the value in working on elections, I think it's clear whether you're talking about, the ballot initiatives to fund education or the electoral, I'll say, punishment of people that haven't supported educators or haven't supported proper funding for education. I think it's pretty clear that these are complementary. I mean, the one stark example I mentioned would be in Arizona, where they literally could only get so much by having a statewide walkout. And that statewide walkout was unbelievably impressive. The amount of organizing that went into that, the amount of community support, but ultimately they had to vote people out of office. Some teachers ran for office and also win a ballot initiative. They couldn't do it with only one or the other. And I think what we've seen and what we're even seeing in the very early days of the Biden-Harris administration is that actually, who's elected matters. It's not enough. I keep returning to the apocryphal, almost definitely not true thing that A. Philip Randolph probably didn't say or that FDR probably didn't say to A. Philip Randolph about, civil rights and racial justice legislation, make me do it. And I find that so useful that you want to have the right people in power, and then you want to organize to make them do it, right? And it's both. And I see that very strongly, and I think we really see it in these strikes. If you lose the ability to organize for a strike, you're going to have a hard time winning your demands. But you're going to want to make those demands out of an opponent that you chose from a set of options through using your electoral voice too.
I completely agree with Becky on that. And, they are complementary. That is collective action and political action. I like to think of them as the two legs that a healthy labor movement would stand on and move forward with. And I think the problem was that for a generation, we were trying to hop forward on one leg, and we really didn't have the other. And what we need, I think, is the ability to use both, because they're both necessary. And I think one of the sad things that occurred, I think, in that period when workers really didn't have the ability to successfully stage collective actions, is that we had to rely too much on politics. And I think that fed a deepening polarization, partisan polarization, because as we relied only on politics, we had to rely only on Democrats. And as we relied only on Democrats, Republicans wanted teachers' unions and other public sector unions dead. And so the inability to act collectively, I think, has been a real debility. And so recovering that collective action leg, I think, is crucial. It shouldn't replace political action. And as you say, Leo, we just engaged in a real struggle for the very survival of our democracy. I don't think it's over. We need to join the political fight for democracy to a fight for, a strong labor movement and democracy in our work relations.
Good. And I'll say that there was, I think, a bad cycle where teachers and their unions were weakened. And so the role of sort of the lobbying advocacy piece became relatively more important. But then that became sort of elevated, and maybe teachers on the ground and sometimes, didn't see the value in getting involved, or there wasn't a push to get involved. And it became this over-reliance on advocacy and legislative relationships with no power building to back that up. And and that works very differently if you have power on the ground to back it up than if you don't. And I think that was a cycle that was going in a bad direction and has been kind of potentially put back on track, or closer to back on track, with this recent resurgence of strikes.
So on to the questions from our audience. First question is, how important was the support of parents and community groups in the success of these teacher strikes of the last 2 years?
I think, I guess essential is like the overused word of our time now, but I would say absolutely essential. And I'll say in a couple of ways. So one would be in a place like Chicago or LA. In LA, the UTLA, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, has on their union staff parent organizers who work with parents and with community groups. That's all they do full time, and absolutely essential. But we also had examples where there wasn't as well resourced or as long term. So in Arizona, one of the great strategies was what they called the walk-in, where this was before they had the walk-out, when they were building and showing support and structure testing their their members, where they simply met in the parking lot before school with the parents and the students, and they wore their Red for Ed t-shirts, and they all walked in together, right? And so they worked, and they were just walking into their jobs. They were doing their jobs. It was not even close to a strike yet. But they said, you know, we're going to walk in as a show of solidarity. And I think the community and in the case of high school students, often student support as well, were absolutely essential.
And we have another question which asks you to sort of situate this focus on alliances with community and bargaining for the common good in the history of teacher unionism in the 1960s. You know, take a stab at that.
Sure. You know, John Shelton has written a really interesting book on teacher strikes in the 1970s. And I know, Leo, you put on an event for that book a few years ago when it first appeared. And he's got a really interesting take on what was happening coming out of the 60s and the 70s. And that is that a lot of the strikes that happened then, teachers did not make much of an effort to build alliances with parents, with the community. And we know that there were some really divisive struggles that emerged out of that period, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and others. That's not certainly not the only one. But there was, I think, not a deeply grounded within the movement as a whole sense that teachers unions and parents groups, just to take the previous question, needed to be working together closely. And I think that this was born of a certain place that the labor movement was at in its history. Then the labor movement was still strong enough, I think, to operate by some of the presumptions that came out of the post-World War II period. And people in the public sector approached collective bargaining much like those in the private sector. Without, I think, always as much of a sense of public opinion and the crucial role that it could play. Now that began to turn once the fiscal crisis hit in the 70s, and many taxpayers began to look at any demand by any public employee as coming out of their own pocket and higher taxes. And that started to bring a reorientation in how people in the public sector, including teachers, went about collective bargaining. But there was a time there in that militant moment that you referred to earlier where that thinking hadn't yet developed.
Yeah. And we have a chapter in the book from Clarence Taylor, who was working in Brooklyn during some of these difficult, to say the least, times in the 60s and 70s, where I think the question might come from partly. And we see, and I think we can look back and reflect honestly about the difference in how educators have approached questions of community needs, community interests, and racial justice in ways that, you know, are uncomfortable, and they should be uncomfortable if we look back, but we can also understand them. You know, I always say that as a unionist, defending due process should not be in opposition to, you know, equity, racial justice, and other of our greater values, that you can have both, you know, due process and protection against arbitrary discipline and a shared interest in equity and justice. And those have been sometimes posed as at odds, and they don't need to be, and they aren't.
So as the intellectual bartender, let me just tell the audience, this is a last call for questions. I have one question here, but if you want to get in a question, this is the last call. I think this is a very interesting question. One of the reasons why the West Virginia strike was so important and was completely unanticipated across the board from everybody, including the teachers themselves that mounted it, was that this, at the very same time, the Supreme Court were hearing arguments in the Janus case. And they had before them a case designed to do the best they could to eviscerate public sector unions. And so the question that comes out of this is this: to what extent can these strikes be understood as a failure of a labor regime, if you want? The New Deal, you think of the National Labor Relations Act. The New Deal idea was that if you had a good relationship, if you encouraged collective bargaining, and in return for that, you would have labor peace. You wouldn't have lots of strikes. And one could argue that that sort of began to unravel at some point in history, and that these strikes took place, particularly at this moment, because collective bargaining was being undermined, and that sort of grand bargain of collective bargaining and a voice for working people was in return for labor peace was being eviscerated. So if either of you have any thoughts on that question.
My thought is, I think I agree exactly with where the question's coming from, and I think about this a lot, right? So the purpose of the National Labor Relations Act was to bring about labor peace and to say, if we don't have a nice, clean, institutionalized collective bargaining table and collective bargaining relationship, we're going to have strikes. It's going to be bad for commerce. We're going to, bosses are going to get beaten to death. It's going to be chaotic and bad for our economy. And let's channel everything into something nice and institutionalized. And what we see is exactly that. So, West Virginia teachers without bargaining rights, they didn't have a table to go, just argue, semi-politely and slam their fists on. They had to walk off the job because they didn't have anywhere else to channel their conflict and their demands. So I think it actually is exactly right that when you don't have a bargaining table, you take matters a different way. What bargaining does institutionalize conflict into something where it's less likely to strike. Although there have been pretty big strikes in LA and Chicago, the bigger strikes were in North Carolina, Arizona, West Virginia, places where they didn't really have bargaining tables. So I think it's exactly right and really demonstrates that the sort of raison d'etre for the National Labor Relations Act.
There's another way. I agree with what Becky said, but there's another way you could also look at the relationship between strikes and bargaining. In the health of a bargaining regime. The most strike-prone decade in U.S. history was the decade in which the New Deal order was still strongest, the 1950s. There were more strikes in that decade than any other. Those strikes didn't indicate the breakdown of a bargaining regime. They indicated, that regime at work, and strikes happened as a way to settle issues that remained outstanding. And so the ability of workers to engage in strikes was crucial to making the regime work, I think. And actually, if you look at the decision that Janus overturned, which was the Abood decision that came from the Supreme Court in the 70s, and the reasoning that Judge Potter Stewart used, why should there be basically an agency shop in the public sector? Well, what he cited there was the role that unions could play to manage discontent and militancy. And I think what had happened between Abood and Janus was that the disappearance of the strike actually made unions more vulnerable to the Supreme Court stepping in and stripping this right away, because the rationale for the right to begin with was you needed strong unions, otherwise you would have militant chaos in schools. So I think that there's that part of it too. And I think I would use that to make a comment on the overall book. It's called Strike for the Common Good. But we don't see strikes as as better than political action, they're just crucial. They need to be part of the picture, and that's why they need to be recovered.
So one last small question, and let me draw the attention of our audience to what Rebecca has put in the chat, which is a link where you can get this book at discount, 30% discount from University of Michigan. And the last question is one about demography. And if I understand it correctly, it is asking you how the changing demography of students in the United States. We've gone in recent years to majority students of color from a long history where white students were the majority. And yet teachers still remain overwhelmingly white. And so that sort of demographic mismatch, which of course has deep sort of points of origin in American political economy. It's not something that just happened. There's deep structural reasons for it. That sort of mismatch, did that have impact or role, some presence in these strikes?
Yeah, I think a few things I'll say. One is that in many of these strikes, racial justice was really at the center. So in Chicago, talking about the schools that were serving primarily Black and brown working class students, in LA and Arizona, predominantly Latinx students, and what their needs were, and that their needs were not being met, and that and not only that, but there were additional racial justice issues like around unequal discipline and other issues that really needed to be addressed. Jesse Hagopian writes a chapter about Black Lives Matter at school and the racial justice demands that the Seattle teachers won around restorative justice and more appropriate discipline. And back in 2014, when far ahead of the debate that we're having now. And I think teachers have been much more reflective and aware on how and whether their own demographics of educators reflects the students they're serving or not. But I think it's also something that we can say is an economic issue. It used to be the case that you could become a teacher, go to a state teachers college, graduate debt-free, and start building towards your pension and a down payment on a house and all the rest of it. Now, if you become a teacher, you are graduating with massive student loan debt. You are likely working a weekend job, a summer job, struggling to pay your healthcare costs, even with that good healthcare. And that's not a job that's available to everyone. And it's a job that will burn people out if they're trying to do it along with a second and third job. So I think understanding the material circumstances helps us understand who can become an educator. Okay, and let me draw the attention of our audience also to the fact that Joe has just put a link in the chat where you can go to the Bargaining for the Common Good Network and see the work that unions are doing all across the country in this area. So let me give both of you a chance for a last word before we close today. Why don't we start with Joe?
Well, thanks, Leo. Thanks for giving us this time and this opportunity to talk and take these questions. And I guess I would just conclude by saying that, this book, your book, what's going on right now around the country, what's going on even today in Chicago and in other cities, all indicate, I think, that we're at a really crucial moment in the history of the labor movement and certainly of teachers' unions. And coinciding with the beginning of a new administration, I think that we're at a moment in time where the activity of recent years can really start to, I think, gain traction and momentum. And our hope, I think, Marilyn and I with our essays that we contribute to that through this book, and we appreciate being part of it.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that what we see, so one thing that happened when the pandemic happened and then this sort of killing of George Floyd and the sort of reckoning or reflection around racism and white supremacy and racial justice happened was Amy, my co-editor, and I thought, well, the pandemic, we certainly didn't anticipate that, but actually many things in the book speak to it. Like there's a chapter on the rise of the sort of predatory educational technology sector. And so we tried to think, there's a foreword that briefly mentions some of the pandemic issues and the questions about reopening. But when it comes to questions about equity and racial justice, those are actually things that all of these educators were thinking about deeply and are really embedded in the chapters of the book. So I think, I hope it sort of lays a foundation for these current issues, some of which were long simmering and some of which were perhaps unexpected, like the pandemic, but really just illuminate things that were there all along. And the, strategic responses are the same responses to other challenges and crises that have always been the sort of array of options with different strategic goals and chances of success. So that's kind of how I see speaking to the current moment.
Great. So let me thank you, Rebecca, and you, Joe, not only for this conversation, but also for having produced this book, which will be useful for many people. Let me thank our audience for having joined us and having engaged in this dialogue with some of your own questions, and wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.